Good morning, everyone. The title of our presentation is Acting in Accordance with the Ordinary Legislative Procedure, Metadiscourse in EU Regulations on Immigration. In slide 2, you find a brief outline of our presentation. After looking at the theoretical framework which forms the basis for this study, we will introduce our corpus and the methodology used to analyze it. Today we are showing you the findings, both quantitative and qualitative, we have so far. We explored EU regulations as a legal genre with specific features. This investigation is an example of the linguistic analysis we carry out in the context of our translation teaching courses at the University of Cagliari, Italy, and therefore is of interest for students who will be future professionals in the field of institutional translation at a European or even global level. First of all, let's have a quick look at the type of documents or instruments issued by the European Parliament and Council. There are regulations, directives, decisions, recommendations and opinions, as explained by this table taken from the book The ABC of EU Law. In particular, we are dealing with regulations today, which are the most binding documents among these ones. They belong to secondary law of the EU. They are legal acts of the EU. In the sense, they are equivalent to acts of Parliament. They are directly applicable and enforceable in all member states simultaneously, and differently from directives, they do not need to be transposed into national law by means of implementing measures. They override all national laws dealing with the same subject. What they say is law, and this is particularly important for our linguistic analysis of translation. In slide 4, you can see some basic principles which have to be taken into consideration when studying or dealing with EU translations. First of all, we have to take into consideration the concept of institutional multilingualism, which means that all the languages of the EU have an equal status. The EU has official languages, working languages and procedural languages, but the institutions produce legislation that is directly applicable to all citizens in all the member states. Therefore, this has to be available and accessible in a language all citizens can understand. Council Regulation number 1, determining the languages to be used by the EU, does not talk about or does not mention translations. It talks about language versions and about authenticity, where authentic stands for legally valid. This could be seen as a sort of conspiracy against professional translators, but it isn't, because, as a matter of fact, translators and interpreters represent a large proportion of the EU institutional staff. The basis for our study is represented by systemic functional linguistics. A clause is a unit in which meanings of three different kinds are combined, each expressing one kind of semantic organization. When we talk about field, we're talking about clause as representation. When we talk about mode, we're talking about clause as message. And when we talk about tenor, we're talking about clause as exchange. A comprehensive classification on functional criteria is offered by Halliday and Mathieson. For the scope of this work, we limit ourselves to metadiscourse, which primarily serves the purpose of textual and interactional organization of the text. In slide 6, we can see Hyland's interpersonal model of metadiscourse with the various categories and their functions. Just as a quick review, interactive features help to guide the reader through the text, and interactional ones involve the reader in the text. Therefore, the interactive categories would explain the function of text and clauses as message or proposition, while the interactional categories would deal with the clause or text as exchange or proposal. I am going to talk about the interactive categories and in particular evidentials and frame markers, and my colleague Antonio is going to introduce the interactional resources found in our corpus, in particular hedges and attitude markers. As you can see from slide 7, we carried out a quantitative analysis using Sketch Engine, a corpus manager and text analysis software. Our corpus is made up of 3 regulations on immigration, 2016, 2018, 2019, in the English and Italian versions, and the table you're seeing shows some basic statistical data such as the number of words and the number of sentences in the 2 versions. Using this concordance software, we searched our corpus for the items in Highland's 2005 list of Metadiscourse features in academic writing. Then we manually checked the concordance lines containing every occurrence of these items in order to ensure that they were functioning as metadiscourse, and we excluded extraneous examples. One of the most frequent structure in all 3 regulations in the English versions is the evidential in accordance with. It is used mainly to refer to information from other texts, which can be past regulation or treatise. Looking at the Italian version, we can notice how the phrase in accordance with is rendered in several different ways, such as conformemente, in conformità, a norma, ai sensi, in ottemperanza, meaning that the Italian language displays a larger lexico-grammatical variety when it comes to this expression. Similarly, as we can see from slide 9, another evidential which shows a high frequency in the 3 texts in English is pursuant to, another typical expression of legal English. When it comes to legal Italian, we can notice that this expression as well is rendered in various ways, such as a norma, ai sensi, conformemente ed in conformità. A corpus-based investigation is particularly valuable since it helps highlight the frequency and collocation of selected textual and linguistic elements and gather information in terms of certain phraseology and discourse structures that are useful for translators. If we start from the assumption that translation is intercultural communication, translators of specialized texts have to be able to recognize not only the most recurrent source text textual linguistic elements, but also the textual linguistic elements to be used in the target text. In slide 10, we talk about regulation as genre. Translators should be aware of the lexical grammatical peculiarities of each genre and subgenre. For example, if we look at the sequencing of the text in EU regulations, we notice that frame markers, another metadiscursive device, such as numbered or ordered lists, are used to organize the linguistic material in the text. The regulation starts with the title, which is the name of the regulation. Then it is introduced by a preamble. The preamble is used to frame the main objective of the regulation and contextualize it within the EU legal space. Then, whereas introduces motivations and reasons before the main texts with chapters and articles, numbered, ordered lists covering substantive provisions, definitions, rights and obligations. Then we find the final clauses, which represent or perform the entry into force of the regulation, and then annexes can follow. Slide 11 shows an example of the preamble. This refers to various other documents, such as the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, to the European Commission's original proposal, and so on, and to the expert opinions used to draft the regulation. This regulation is issued after transmission of the draft to the national parliaments, and the adverbial whereas introduces several points that contain the main premises, explanations of motivations and reasons. In slide 12, You can see the typical final clauses in a regulation. This part is called entry into force. A typical feature here, as in other earlier parts, is the use of the modal shall, as in this regulation shall enter into force, or this regulation shall be binding, which exemplifies the binding and mandatory nature of this type of text.
Simultaneously with its organization as a message, the clause is also organized as an interactive event involving the writer and the audience. In the clause as exchange, the content of the text is conveyed through the act of speaking, that is, that the writer adopts for himself a particular speech role and in so doing assigns to the reader a complementary role. The most fundamental types of speech roles which lie behind any interactive process are just two, giving and demanding. These two variables, when taken together, define the four primary speech functions: offer, command, statement, and question. Halliday and Mathiesen use the term proposition to refer to a statement or question, and the parallel term proposal to refer to offers and commands. The semantic function of a clause in the exchange of goods and services is a proposal. Since we are dealing with regulations, and what they say is law, they primarily have to do with the speech function of a command. Therefore, I'm discussing now metadiscourse at the layer of meaning of a proposal. So I'm looking at the interaction of metadiscourse resources in the text under scrutiny. Among the metadiscursive devices which involve the readers in the text, I'm going to deal in particular with attitude markers, adjectives in a specific way, and hedges, modal verbs, should in particular. Attitude markers convey the writer's affective and emotional attitudes, expressing an explicit positive or negative value that is gradable to propositions. Attitude markers are most explicitly signaled by attitude verbs, adverbials, nouns, and adjectives. Due to time restrictions, for the scope of this study, we limit ourselves only to attitude adjectives. In this study, we are not taking into account determinative adjectives, that is, deictics, numerals, and classifiers, as they are defining adjectives and convey an experiential metafunction in the clause. As for instance, illegal immigration taken from Regulation 2019, in which the adjective is a classifier and has defining function within the nominal group. We take into consideration only epithet since it does not indicate an objective property of the thing itself, but some quality of the thing, expressing, in so doing, the writer's subjective attitude towards it, thus representing an interpersonal element in the meaning of the nominal group. The line between epithet and classifier is not a very sharp one, but it is possible to recognize some significant differences. Classifiers, from a semantic point of view, do not accept degrees of comparison or intensity. For instance, we cannot have a more illegal immigration or a very legal immigration. But classifiers tend to be organized in mutually exclusive, discrete and exhaustive sets. Immigration is either legal or illegal. In the corpus under scrutiny, we found a positive adjective of the attributive type, for example, in Regulation 2019 appropriate safeguards, and of the predicative type, it should therefore be possible for immigration officers and so on, taken from Regulation 2019. As stated above, a crucial feature of epithet, in contrast to classifier, is that they are semantically not extreme or absolute in nature, but they are gradable, describing qualities that can be measured or graded in some way. In the following example, the positive adjective good has been intensified by the use of a comparative better management of immigration taken from Regulation 2019. According to Halliday and Halliday-Mathiesen, expressions of attitude tend to be strung prosodically throughout the clause. Accordingly, interpersonal epithets also tend to be reinforced by other epithets, forming accumulations that create rhetorical figures of words or contributing to the same meaning function. By adding synonyms, intensifiers and the like, the aim is that of ideally doubling the interactional meaning function of the metadiscourse. In this case, look at the following example taken from Regulation 2019: dignified and effective return, readmission and reintegration. We can also notice the alliteration which enhances the prosody of the cluster. As you can see from this slide 20, the quantitative analysis revealed the occurrence of such adjectives as appropriate, better, effective, possible, and relevant in all the three regulations under examination. Let's move to hedges. Hedges are devices which indicate the author's decision to recognize and admit in some way potential alternative viewpoints and voices, and thus withhold complete commitment to a proposition. Hedges highlight subjectivity of a position by allowing information to be presented as an opinion rather than an objective fact, and therefore open that position to negotiation. For the scope of this study, we dealt only with modal operators, and in particular, we looked at the three categories of hedges which play a major part in EU regulations, should, may, and shall. This table shows the occurrences in the three regulations. In a regulation, what they say is law. So looking at the sentence from a proposal point of view, the meaning of a positive and negative poles is prescribing and proscribing. Positive, imperative, do it, and negative, imperative, don't do it. But occurrences show the presence of devices in a semantic space conveying intermediate possibilities. These different scales of obligations are defined as modulation and are expressed through in other two ways: by a finite modal operator, modal adjuncts, and of course by the combination of the two. Modal auxiliaries, whether deontic or epistemic, can be interpreted as hedges whenever they express a certain degree of vagueness. Due to time restrictions, we are now going to deal only with should. In the first example from Regulation 2016, there is no explicit obligation to involve EU member states' authorities further with the transmission of information, merely that greater involvement would be the best idea. Any exchange or transmission of information and documents by the authorities of the member states should be in accordance with Directive 95. In some cases, should occurs with some adverbial edges where possible and relevant, enhancing, in so doing, fuzziness and thus producing vagueness and indeterminacy. Indeed, all these devices reduce the generality of a proposal and, of course, of a proposition by limiting, to a certain extent, its objective relevance. Let's look at the example taken from Regulation 2019. Information on the composition of migratory flows should, where possible and relevant, include information on declared migrants' age, gender profile, and a family, and on unaccompanied minors. The modal should has been translated in two different ways, according to its different syntactical construction. With the mood of condizionale in the present tense, dovrebbe, dovrebbero, in which the modal verb dovrebbe governs the infinitive form of the main verb that follows: dovrebbe rafforzare, dovrebbe adottare, dovrebbe assicurare, or, as an alternative, when the conditional form of the modal verb governs the two auxiliaries be or have, the translation has been rendered with the predicative adjective è opportuno, stressing convenience and appropriateness. In both cases, with conditional mood and the predicate adjective, the meaning is not assertive, but rather seeking corroboration by rounding off and smoothing the locutionary force of the peremptoriness of the regulation. Should signals vagueness and thus confirms the medium strength and the freedom of action. Modality acts like hedging, emphasizing the weak, tentative nature, used not for command but for advisable action in cooperative speech. Although the general tendency of lawmakers is that of avoiding ambiguity where possible, The role assumed in prescriptive regulations is rather remarkable, as already seen from the quantitative analysis carried out in this study. Let's come to the conclusions. Concluding, what we showed so far is an example of what we do in our translation courses at the University of Cagliari. Using parallel texts in the source and in the target language, we stress both the educational and professional training perspectives. We believe that the combination of corpus linguistics and systemic functional linguistics plays an undeniable significant role in the formation of professional translators who thus develop their metalinguistic awareness and competencies together with their technical, practical and professional skills. Thank you very much for your attention.